Well, good evening. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for having me. Let me introduce myself in a way I haven't done so very often, and it kind of goes like this. Hi, I'm Julie's husband. And I think I'll just leave it at that. We're driving in this afternoon, and she was saying, "Oh, I remember going over here, and I remember going over here," and she always kind of comes back home, comes back to her roots when she's in this part of the country. And I'm glad she can be here this weekend and get reunited with some of you and some of her family. And I'm glad I can tag along as well. First time I ever came over here, we were dating, and first time I ever came over here, came to her grandparents' house in Sciotoville, I think that's correct. And her grandmother had lost her vision. She couldn't see. And so we walked in the door, and I don't know if she knew I was in the house yet or not, or if it didn't really matter to her. But all I remember her saying, "Did you bring your little husband?" And I thought, well, first of all, we're not married yet. But anyway, she brought her little husband. So I'm here. I miss Jack McGlone. I loved him. He was always so fun to be with and enjoyed time to just visit with him. And he always seemed larger than life to me. And I know he was around these parts for a long, long time, and will always be special to Julie especially, and to me as well. And I know to all of you. And I just appreciated him so very, very. Can I tell one on Lynn Wessel before we get started? Can I please? Your spouse is saying yes. I guess really the only time we've ever been together that I recall was at a wedding in Columbus, Ohio, 100 years ago. Well, it was in the 20th century, I'll tell you that. Way back in the 20th century. And I was in Columbus. I was the best man for my roommate at Florida College, a friend named Wayne Galloway. And Wayne was getting married, and Lynn did the ceremony for Wayne and Phyllis. And the night before we did the ceremony, we had the rehearsal. And what I remember about the rehearsal was somebody was singing that old Carpenter song that we sang at every wedding back then, "Close to You." Anybody remember the song "Close to You"? It was at every wedding, kind of like the national anthem of weddings. And so we were singing, somebody came and sang "Close to You." And Lynn had this great idea. The guys were all over here in the side room. And Lynn had this idea that when the second verse began, that's when the guys would come out. Do you know how the second verse of that song begins? "Why do birds suddenly appear?" And we walked out. And we decided maybe that's not great timing, So that's Lynn, that's what I remember. Good to be with you again. Our series this weekend is on faith, and faith needed in times like these. And we live in times like these. We live in times in which things just seem to be upside down. And those who are seeking to do what is right and have a mindset for that seem sometimes to feel like we're in the minority. So we're going to talk about that this weekend. And tonight I want to talk about what is faith. If we're going to talk about faith, let's define it. Let's talk about what it is in very practical terms. And then tomorrow morning, I'm going to take the men, I think at 10 o'clock, is that correct? I'm going to take the men, and I'm going to talk about 7 faith qualities from my Old Testament hero, and that's Caleb. And so I'm going to talk to the men about that, and then Julie's going to talk to the women at 10 o'clock. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to talk about everyone has a story that's going to put your faith to the test. So that's tonight and tomorrow night, and we'll look forward to being together then and Sunday as well. Open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews the 10th chapter, beginning in verse 39. That's where I want to start tonight. Hebrews chapter 10, and beginning in let's begin in verse 35. Let's back up to verse 35 of Hebrews chapter 10. I read out of the New American Standard Version, so yours may be a little different. That's okay. Therefore, he says, do not throw confidence. Why not? Because he says, it has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come, and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. One of the things that I say a lot is that life is hard. It just is. And some days, it just gets harder. And ladies and gentlemen, the easiest response when life gets hard and harder, the easiest response to overwhelming problems that come upon all of us, the easiest response is to panic. The easiest response is to just try and run away from all of that. And sometimes the easiest response, at least in our thinking, is to just, because we don't understand everything, and we don't understand God, and we certainly don't understand His timing, the easiest response just says, well, forget this, and we chuck our faith, and we shrink back. And that's the one thing He says in verse 39, you can't do. The one thing He says, do not do, is when life gets hard or harder, is to take your faith and just chuck it and look the other way and walk the other way. Because we can't do it. So let's talk about faith and what it is and how it works and what it looks like and how we flesh out this thing called faith that we read about in these verses and hundreds more. The first thing I'd like to tell you about faith, the first thing I would like to tell you about faith is that faith just comes very easy for me. That it's just natural for me. I'd like to tell you that I always have an unwavering confidence in God, that I just always trust Him about everything, that I always pray like I should, and that I never worry about anything. I would like to tell you all of that. But that's called a lie. Because sometimes my faith grows weak and weary. Sometimes the muscles of my faith grow flabby. Sometimes my faith isn't what it ought to be. Jesus on one occasion was conversing with a father. And in Mark chapter 9 and verse 24, this dad turns to Jesus and he said, Lord, I believe. And then he said, would you help me with my unbelief? You ever been there? I've been there. Or Luke 17 and verse 5, the disciples plead with Jesus and they say, Lord, would you increase our faith? And sometimes I think Matthew chapter 8 and verse 26, Jesus is talking to me when He says, oh, you of little faith. Sometimes people ask, how do you preachers know what to preach about? I can't answer that for anybody else. But for me, it's easy. I preach on the stuff I need. And I've learned a long time ago that what I need, probably everybody else needs too. And what I need is faith. In fact, I don't know anybody who doesn't need more faith. I don't know anybody who doesn't need a stronger conviction in the things of God. So let's quit pretending that we have all the answers. Let's quit pretending like we have it all together all of the time. Let's quit pretending like we never question about anything, that we never doubt anything, because I'll just tell you, that's phony. That's what that is. I don't know anybody who hasn't struggled at some point in their lives with faith. And I'll tell you this, you're going to need it, because some days are hard. And some days get even harder than that. So what is this thing we're talking about this weekend? What is faith? It only has 5 letters. This little word that is just so easy to flow off of our lips. And we tell people all the time, well, you just got to have faith. And that's true. That's 100% true. But what does that mean? Well, we know faith is essential for salvation. We know what that means. Ephesians 2 and verse 8. For by grace are you saved through faith. Grace is God's part. Faith is my part and your part. John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in it, you got to have faith. We understand all of these verses about faith. Mark 16 and verse 16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. We understand all of these verses about faith. So we get it that faith saves us. But I'm here to say tonight, faith also is what's going to get you through the tough times of life. And it's the only thing that will. How would you complete the sentence? If I had a board up here and I wrote, faith is, and I put a blank, what would you put in the blank? If you had to come up with one word, a one-word definition for faith, what would it be? And I think I would probably write the word trust there. Because at its very essence and at its very core, that's what faith is. It comes down to one simple thing. Either you trust God or you do not. It's that simple. Faith is trusting God to help me get through troublesome times. Times that I may not understand, with end points out here that I may not be able to see and even comprehend. Faith is trusting God to get me through this maze called life. Trusting God to get me through this problem or that one, this temptation or that one, this trial or that one. It's trusting God to get me from here to heaven. That's what it's all about. You ever get on an airplane? That's when you learn about faith. I don't even think about it. And so you get on an airplane and you take a trip somewhere. Do you know the pilot? Why would you turn yourself over, life, limb, in the pursuit of happiness, to somebody you've never even met before? You don't know this person. Why would you do that? There's only one reason anybody would ever do that, and that's faith. You have faith that he's been trained. You have faith that he's been certified to fly that particular aircraft. You have faith in the principles of aerodynamics that you studied in science and physics class in school if you weren't sleeping through it. You have faith in the ATC, the air traffic control system, that's going to make sure that your plane is separated from all of the other planes. And so you take all of this evidence, and on the basis of evidence, you get on an airplane. And it all comes down to faith. But here's the kicker. If you decide to take a trip and get on an airplane, how much of you gets on the airplane? And you think to yourself, well, I don't know if I want to commit 100%. I think I want to take this trip, but I think I'm only going to commit 80%. I think 80% of me will get on the plane. That's silly. That doesn't work that way. If you're going to get on the airplane, it's 100% commitment. That's what that is. Now somebody says, can you prove that that airplane can't possibly ever crash? No, I can't prove that. I tell you what I can prove. I can prove it statistically. That the greatest danger you will ever be in on your trip is not in the airplane. It's in your car driving to the airport. Have you not seen the way people drive around here? You know? God says you're going to have to trust me even though you don't know all the answers, even though you don't always understand me, even though you don't understand my timing. God says, I'm asking you to trust me. And when I ask for your commitment, I'm not asking for 80% commitment. It's 100% or none at all. What I'm saying to you is our faith has to be practical. Because if your faith isn't practical, it's absolutely useless. And it's not enough to talk about faith in here. It's not enough to sing about faith in here. It's not enough to read Bible verses about faith in here. You know why? Because we don't live in here. We live out there. And in a few minutes, we're going to leave and we're going to go home. And life gets very difficult. And life gets very hard. And we don't always know the way to go. And that's when faith has to do its work. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith, not by sight. And that's hard for us because our culture is so sight-oriented. If we can touch it, if we can see it, if I've got the money in the bank, then I can rest. I can relax. I can sleep. But if not, I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't relax. I can worry. But that's the opposite of faith. And maybe it's in these times in our lives where God does His best work for us. When you have nowhere else to go but Him. When you have nowhere else to look but up. And that's when you start learning about the depth of your faith. Because I'll tell you, if your faith doesn't count in hard times, your faith doesn't count at all. So I'm going to leave you tonight with 6 things. I don't do PowerPoint, so I'm going to give you in various lessons things that I want you to remember and write down. So I want you to find somewhere to write, because invariably this is what happens. I get to point number 3 or 4 or 5, and then somebody comes out in the foyer and says, I didn't write that down. Could you go through those again? No, I'm not going to go through those again. I'm not going to preach the sermon 2 times. There are 6 things about faith, 6 truths about faith. It's right in the text. These 6 points are right out of the text here in Hebrews chapter, moving into chapter 11. So on a piece of paper somewhere, just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all right here. 6 truths you need to know about faith. Number 1, write this down. Faith requires assurance and conviction. Faith requires assurance and conviction. Verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction, some translations say evidence, of things not seen. Do you know the word assurance means, by definition, to stand under something so that it is supported? And what he's saying is your faith supports you. I love what the old King James Version says here when he says that faith is the substance of things hoped for. Well, what does that mean? Well, words mean something. If you look at the word substance, you see that word is easily divided between sub and stance. If you look at the suffix stance, it means literally to stand. We talk about politicians. There's a lot of people talking about politicians these days. And they talk about what's his or her stance on this particular issue. Well, if they're a politician, they're on both sides, okay? But we understand what stance is. It means where do they stand on that? The prefix sub means under. A submarine goes under the water. So what you have in substance is, if you put all of that together, What he's saying is, your faith is what stands under you. That's what he says. Literally. Your faith stands under you when everyone around you is falling apart. When everything around you is falling apart, your faith will undergird you. Your faith will stand under you and support you. It's your faith that's going to give you the strength to go on another day. It's your faith, he says, that is the assurance of your hope. And then he says, the conviction of evidence of things not seen. What do you need to convict a criminal in a court of law? Well, you better have proof, and proof is another word for evidence. What is faith? It's evidence. It's living proof that God's going to take care of me, and God's going to take care of my family, and God's going to take care of this situation, no matter what. It's being convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is in control and I'm not. You see, real Bible faith is not this flimsy, goosebump, emotional kind of deal. That's not what biblical faith is all about. I want you to look closely at the words that describe this biblical concept of faith in verse 1. Look at the strength of these words. Assurance, conviction, substance, evidence that God's going to take care of you. Always has, always will. So faith, the first thing he says is faith is all about assurance and conviction. And then number 2, write this down. Faith points to the future. That's in verse 1 as well. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Tell me which way hope goes. Hope goes to the future. It only points in one direction. Now the problem with life is our worries and anxieties go the same direction. And so we worry about tomorrow, future. We worry about what's down the road, future. We worry about what if this happens and what if that happens. And we conjure up all of these what if scenarios, most of which, by the way, are never going to happen. But it doesn't stop us from worrying about all of that. What if my marriage struggles? What if my kids become prodigal? What if I get cancer? What if? Why do we worry about those things? Well, we worry about those things because we tend to look at life future in the light of our ability to make sure we're in control. And if you're viewing tomorrow and the days ahead in the light of your ability to make sure you control everything, then you might as well go ahead and worry, because I'm going to tell you, you're not in control of much of anything at all. But if you view the tomorrows of your life in the light of God's ability to take care of you, then you find the core strength of your faith. Because if my marriage struggles, God says, I'm going to be right there with you. If my kids walk away from what is right, God says, I'm not walking away from you. I'm not going anywhere. If you get cancer, God says, we're going to go together to the treatments. We're going to go together through the side effects. We're going to go together through every day that's going to come, through the great unknown. And he says in Hebrews 13 and verse 5, I'm not walking away. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Wherever you go, God says, I'm right there. I'm walking beside you. The 23rd Psalm talks about that he's with us wherever we go. So faith, if you want to get really practical, points future. Third, faith involves the unseen. That's at the end of verse 1. The conviction or the evidence of things not seen. That's the hard part. I want to see it. I want to know the answers. I want to know, where is God taking this and where is God leading me? I want to know those things. And so given the choice between walking by faith and walking by sight, a lot of us are like Thomas of old. Lord, I got to see it to believe it. Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails and put my hand into his side, I can't believe it. I've got to see it. And Jesus came and said, Thomas, because you have now seen me, do you now believe? Blessed are those who've never seen me and yet believe. And that's faith. There's a guy by the name of Oswald Sanders who wrote a book on spiritual leadership, and he makes a statement in the book that I thought was really good. I wrote it down. No pessimist ever made a great leader. The pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. So are you an optimist or a pessimist? So let's take those ideas and put them in Bible terms. Do you walk by faith? Or do you walk by sight? You have to see it to believe it. I'll tell you, all of the great men and women of Scripture, and you want to go down and you want to make a list from Joshua, Caleb, we're going to talk about in the morning, Joseph, Daniel, David, Esther, Ruth, Mary, Paul. Make a list. They were all characterized by one thing. They grew enough in their faith, they didn't have to see it. They had an optimistic conviction that God somehow, in some way, in His time, as we sing about, God's going to take care of it. Number 4. He says in verse 2 that faith is basic to pleasing God. Faith is basic to pleasing God. For by it the men of old gained approval. Do you understand the rest of Hebrews 11 as a commentary on verse 2? The rest of Hebrews chapter 11 gives us example after example of people who started with nothing and ended up with great blessing. Why? Because they learned to trust God. That's why. And even God goes back to a time when there was nothing and sets the precedent by creating the visible out of the invisible. Verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. God made something when there was nothing. Now you look at that and say, well, I don't understand what that has to do with me. Well, I'm going to tell you what it has to do with me. If God can do this in the creation, if God can make something out of nothing, can He not take your life right now, regardless of what problems you face, and on the basis of your faith, make something out of what you think is an impossible situation? We say, Lord, I don't know where this is going. I don't see any way any good can come out of this. And God says, stop right there. If I can create the whole world out of nothing, you don't think I can handle you? You don't think I can take care of this situation and bring something good? You see, the key in all of this is faith. It worked for Abel. That's in verse 4. It worked for Enoch. That's in verse 5. And it'll work for you. That's in verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible. It is impossible for you to please God. He doesn't say without faith, it is improbable. That's what he says. He doesn't say without faith, it is highly unlikely. He said without faith, it is impossible. Impossible. So if I come along and I'm going through difficulty and I'm going to work all of this out on my own. God says, if you do it that way, it's impossible for you to please me. You're not walking by faith, you're walking by sight. Now, some people come along and they try to fake it with God. They're going to pull one on God. And so they go through hard times and they decide the answer is, I'm going to study my Bible. I'm going to read my Bible more every day. I'm going to pray more every day. I'm coming to Bible class in the churches, and I'm going to take part. I'm going to volunteer for everything. I'll give more money. I'll pray more. I'll just do more. Sign me up for whatever's needed. I want to be spiritually busy. You're playing games. You think that impresses God? God says, without faith, it is impossible to please me. So don't try to slip in substitutes for faith. Your car runs on gas. And that's the fuel that has been designed for engines to consume. Now, I can go down a list and give you all the negatives of that. It pollutes the environment, it's flammable, and it costs a lot of money. So let's say one day you decide that you know better. And so you stick the water hose in your gas tank and fill her up. Because it makes more sense, it's cheaper, it's not going to blow up. It's not going to pollute anything, and there's a lot more of it. Okay, but there's only one problem. Anybody want to tell me what the problem is? Go ahead. Speak. It's not going to work, is it? It's not going to work. You can't drive your car when you fill your tank full of water. And God says you can't please me if you start substituting everything else in place of the one thing I'm asking you to have. And that's faith. And then he says, number 5, faith means we believe God is real. That's in verse 6. Without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is. Can somebody come to the conclusion that you are a person of faith because they watch how you respond to hardship and difficulties of life? When you are besieged by questions you can't answer, do you show faith or do you fall apart as if God just isn't even real? I tell people all of the time, little eyes are watching. Parents and grandparents, you don't think our kids and our grandkids, you don't think they're going to grow up and remember watching you as to how you handled the hard times of life? Don't you understand that your kids and your grandkids are going to go through hard times just like you have? They're not going to be immune from those. They're going to go through them too. But there's one thing that's going to get them through the hard times of life, and that is they're going to get together with their siblings and their family, and they're going to talk about your faith. Guaranteed. Or lack thereof. Man, do you remember how Remember what Dad did when he got the diagnosis? And it was bad. You remember how Dad called us all together and talked to us? That if our faith means anything, it's got to mean everything now. Remember how Dad gathered us all together and led us in prayer? Remember that? Remember Dad's faith? If he could do it, I can do it. Remember when Grandma was going through the hardest of hard? You remember how she would sing? You remember how she talked about God? You remember her faith? If she could do it, we can do it. I tell you, little eyes are watching. What do they see? And that's what he says in verse 6. For he who comes to God must believe that he is. People have to see that. And finally, number 6, faith understands God rewards. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Do you seek him? Is your faith that deep? Lord, I'm tired of wrestling with this. I'm tired of staying up half the night. I'm tired of worrying about this. Lord, take it. It's too heavy for me. I can't take it anymore. You have to take it. And that's the very thing he asks us to do. Cast your burdens on me, he says. Do you believe he's capable of carrying your load? Let me leave you with 2 questions. 6 truths about faith, 2 questions. The first question people ask is, why is faith so hard for me? Why is faith so hard for me? Well, there's always an answer to that question. Maybe the answer is fear. Maybe you're afraid that God will not come through for the likes of you. Maybe it's this fear that maybe you've asked for God's help, or maybe you've asked for God's forgiveness, or maybe you've asked for God's direction one too many times, and maybe you think God's tired of hearing from me, and so we become afraid to talk to him about the very thing that's on our heart. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's bitterness and resentment and anger. You know, bitterness and resentment and anger squeezes out faith. And sometimes it's bitterness and resentment and anger directed toward God. Don't tell me people don't get mad at God. I know they do. I've had people confess that they were angry at God. It happens all the time. Maybe it's pride. I don't think I need God. I got this. I'm in control. I can do this on my own. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's hypocrisy. Maybe I'm faking it. And I know God knows. And so I just kind of leave it there. Why is faith so hard for me? Well, there's always a reason. And I'm thinking if you looked in the mirror, you might find out the why. And the second why is it so hard to live a day at a time? You know, the Bible tells us to do that. In Psalm 90 and verse 12, he says, teach us to number our days. He just said the average lifespan, 70, if due to strength, 80. But he says, I want you to number not your years, I want you to number your days. God gives us several years, but he gives us one day at a time. So how do I live a day at a time? By faith. Matthew 6 and verse 34, do not be anxious for tomorrow will take care of itself. Every day has enough trouble of its own. How do you live a day at a time? That's what he says to do. By faith. Psalm 118 and verse 24, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Live a day at a time. How do I do it? By faith. And I tell you, you're going to need it. You're going to need faith. Because life is hard. And some days it gets harder. And so when life gets hard and harder, what are you going to do? You're going to just chuck it? You're going to shrink back? Just quit? I know people who've done that. And the Hebrew writer says, you can't do that. We are not those who shrink back to destruction, but those who have faith to the preserving of our soul. Now, in the time we have ahead of us this weekend, we're going to take what we talked about tonight, we're going to develop it a little bit further. And we're going to look at some people of faith. We're going to look at some things that really test us. And then I'm going to leave you with a final challenge. I think Sunday night at 5. I'm going to leave you with a final challenge that I think challenges all of us to get out of our comfort zone and to walk like that. I hope that we can be an encouragement to you. I know you'll be an encouragement to me and to Julie. And so you don't have to remember my name. I'm just Julie's husband. No big deal. We sing the song, and it's number 347. What's the name of it?
Who will follow Jesus?
Who will follow Jesus? That's a great question. Who will? If you've never rendered obedience to Jesus, and by faith come to Him, and through faith decided to change your life and change your way of living and repent, and by faith confess His name, and by faith be baptized into Him for the remission of your sins. All of that's by faith. We drew a big circle and put faith in the middle of the circle. All those things are in that circle. God says, I'm going to save you by my grace. That's God's part. Through faith. And that's your part. Why don't you come, Lord, stand.